The Science Museum Group cares for an astonishingly diverse and internationally significant collection of 7.3 million items from science, technology, engineering, medicine, media and art. And how we care for those collections is changing. Over 300,000 objects from the Science Museum's collections are currently stored at Blythe House, a historic building in Hammersmith, West London, which we share with the V&A and the British Museum. Blythe House is being sold, so the Science Museum is moving out. But we're not just packing up and moving on. The One Collection project is the Science Museum Group's biggest project for a generation, and as well as moving to a pioneering new store at the National Collections Centre in Wiltshire, the One Collection project is committed to improving documentation and digitisation across the collection. At Blythe House, this means a production line approach to collections care and management. A number of specialist teams are working methodically through the collections in order to improve collection care and access for the future. The first team in this workflow is the hazards team, who assess each object for hazardous substances.
So the hazards team are the first team to enter any given room, and we go ahead and we identify any hazards that might be present in the objects so that they are then safe for other teams to work with. Today we are working with the contents of a 1930s doctor's bag, so we've got lots of different medicines in here. And at the moment we're looking at this bottle of calomel powder pills.
So that's a mercurous chloride, so we're going to label it with any according hazards. It's an environmental hazard and an irritant.
And normally if we want to make something like this safe, if there's a potential that the object could leak, that the contents could get out that might be hazardous, we use something called parafilm, and that's like a conservation grade cling film. And we use that to create a firm seal around the top of the object to make sure that the contents can't escape, and then it will be safe for other teams to handle. We also make labels for these, so once we have identified the hazards in an object, we also create a red visual marker, a red label like this, and that makes sure that anyone who approaches the object can immediately see that there is some kind of hazard present. We also then go on to update the computer record on the database of objects that we have, so that when anyone looks up the object on the database, they can also tell in more detail what hazards are in that object. If we don't find any hazards in an object, then we leave it, and the next team coming, the inventory team, will create a no hazard record. So one of the good things about this project is that every object will be confirmed as not hazardous if it doesn't have a hazard, and if it does, we will flag that hazard.
And sometimes we'll have a situation where we suspect something has a hazard, but we're not quite sure what exactly it is. So we'll assume the worst case scenario and go with what the worst possible hazard could be.
Most museum objects which contain hazards are low risk and can be handled safely with care. But for the small number of objects which are high risk, we work with external specialists to manage the risk and make sure the objects are safe to move. After the hazards team have assessed them, objects are ready for the inventory team to take over. The inventory team focus on identification, barcode labelling, location data and condition assessments. Because there are so many objects to process, the workflow teams at Blythe House use software that is used to keep track of stock in warehouses and retail. Using this simplified system means we can work much more quickly through 300,000 objects than if we'd used our existing database.
Okay, so now that we have ascribed our object with a unique barcode, we are going to do the actions for the object. So, Dory, can you see any hazards in relation to this object?
No, I can't.
No. Can you scan the location for this object, please? Perfect. Okay, and so what do you think about the condition of this object?
I would say it's fair condition.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Is it marked as well?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, in a fair condition and marked.
Mm-hmm.
So for this project, we have a grading system. So we have good, fair, and poor as a condition, and unacceptable, which sends the object to conservation first. So now that we have processed this object, because we have given it a label with a unique barcode and have carried out the hazard, location, and condition actions, the object is processed in terms of inventory, and so it can pass on to the other teams, so photography.
Sometimes, the hazards or inventory teams may come across an object which is in need of attention from the conservation team. Conservators on the One Collection project work to stabilise objects for transportation. The majority of our objects are ready to go, but occasionally an object will need work before it can be safely packed. The conservation team can deal with moderate hazards, such as gently vacuuming up lead corrosion or draining a dangerous chemical, and they can also make repairs to any objects which have deteriorated. They also take things apart or put them back together, depending on what would be best for the object's journey to the National Collection Centre. After an object has been hazard checked, inventoried and possibly conserved, then it's time for it to be photographed. Currently, there are high-quality photographs of around 5% of Science Museum Group objects available online, but One Collection will see that rise to at least 75%. And instead of bringing the objects to the photography studio as we normally would, the studio goes to the object.
Just making sure that the object is angled, it's in focus, and it's in the viewfinder fully, so there's no details are missing. And then once I photographed an object, then Sam is looking for possible inscriptions on the objects.
Which on these, we've actually had a couple which do have inscriptions or what we think might be maker's marks on them. So I'm then going to go onto our software on the phone and taking a separate picture to the one we've already taken, just to the inscription.
And then once the photography team has processed the object, the next team is packing.
The metadata for each object is embedded in the photograph itself, using the barcode labels that the inventory team applied. So the photograph is automatically and permanently linked to the correct object record. Volunteers play a key role in photography in the One Collection project and with the inventory and packing teams. As well as recruiting volunteers externally, we've also had a number of employee placements from across the Science Museum Group, where staff are building new skills in collections management. Sometimes, objects at Blythe House are not what they seem. A small number of objects will have a problem with their record, which means that the hazards, inventory or photography teams cannot process them without some help. And this is where the collections information team come in. Made up of curators, documentation assistants and registrars, the collections information team are the detectives of the One Collection project. When a problem with an object arises, it is taken out of the main workflow temporarily, and the collections information team use their research skills to resolve any issues so that the object can go back into the workflow and be safely moved. The documentation team solve problems relating to object numbers, fixing sequences which may have gone awry, or part numbering large and complicated objects which will need to be packed in separate containers. Registrars work on issues related to legal status, like ownership, historic loans, new acquisitions, and removals from the collection. The curatorial team work closely with documentation and registration, and they use their research skills to solve problems from identifying obscure medicines to unravelling the histories of overlooked collections. They also work closely with their colleagues at the Science Museum to make sure that curatorial business as usual can continue while also delivering the collection move. The collection information team allows the workflow to keep operating at speed by taking anything complicated out of their way. Only about 2% of objects need this special treatment, but that is still over 6,400 mysteries that need solving before they can move to their new home. Once an object has been through all of these processes, the next stage in the workflow is packing. These 300,000 objects will be going on an 82-mile journey by road, and careful attention is needed to prepare for the journey.
So first of all, we need to attach a barcode to the container, and then we will program the location of the box into the computer using the barcode, and then we'll start adding our objects into the container. So when all the objects are in the container, we scan their individual barcodes and they go onto the computer, and then we digitally pack them as well as physically packing them. So we digitally pack them into that specific container. So then they are sealed within that container and they stay in that container for the rest of their journey. So when we put the tissue puffs in, we put the smooth side against the objects so that the object can't get caught in the crinkles of the tissue and potentially get caught up or damaged.
Yeah, and it looks a bit like a shower cap, doesn't it? Or a jellyfish.
Or I always say a jellyfish.
A jellyfish, yeah, that's it.
And for really big objects like this, they'll be transported on the pallet. So it's up to us to ensure they're properly secured onto the pallet, and then the pallet will be given a barcode like a box.
Once they are packed, it's time to go. Some of these objects will be leaving Blythe House for the first time in 40 years to travel to their new home in Wiltshire at the Science Museum Group's National Collection Centre.
We're using an external transport company to do all our moves for us. We envisage it will take us about a year and a half and around 200 to 300 truckloads. Most of our objects will exit through our scissor lift here and make their way to the National Collection Centre in Wroughton.
One Collection is a once-in-a-generation project which will leave an important legacy in collections care and access for both the Science Museum Group and the heritage sector. To find out more about our collections and to follow the progress of the One Collection project, visit our website.